So let me introduce the presenter for this class, Beth Taylor. Beth is a certified genealogist and works as a United States and Canada research specialist at the Family Search Library. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University and has worked for Family Search for almost 20 years. Her specialties and interests include DNA, Quakers, land records, probate records, organizing, and of course, tracing women, and much more. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So today, I want to start with a quote. Get this. One of my favorite quotes is from a historian named Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and she said, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." Now, sometimes we look at this as kind of silly that you have to um, make waves in order to make history, but in reality, because of the whole legal system that we work with here in the United States, for a long time, women who were behaved, there wasn't a lot of space for them to be recorded or their names to be mentioned in the records. And so, as we see throughout the class, it really meant that those women who were raised, who got married, who had children, and who died, oftentimes don't show up in the records the way that we hope that they would. And so today I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about how and when we can find the women and how we can trace those women, even though well-behaved women seldom make history. Now, I do want to start by introducing one of my ancestors, and she's always been a little bit of one of the people I notice the most because she and I share a name. Well, her married name is my full complete name. My full name is Elizabeth, but she was named Elizabeth Crosby. She married a Benjamin Taylor. And for the most part, she didn't have a very long life. Not a lot happened to her because she had a son in 1836. Her son was named Ambrose, Warren County, Ohio, and then she passed away in childbirth not long afterwards. So there's not a lot of known information about Elizabeth. And so it can be easy to just feel like I'm never going to learn more. But there are records out there are resources, and there are ways that I can tell her story despite that. But sometimes I feel like we look at women and it's kind of the same way when you look at your high school yearbook and there's that no photo available section. There's no photo, there's nothing. That person is kind of anonymous. And it's very easy to see women that way. But today we want to see if there are ways that we can still track them down and we can still again tell their stories. So we'll come back to Elizabeth at the end of class. So objectives today, we're actually going to start with the research strategies. Oftentimes I do strategies at the end, but I think it's good when we think about tracing women to think about the strategies and then apply that a little bit to the records. So we're going to go through some kind of the basic strategies when tracing women, and then we're going to look at some various records discussing why women appear and why they don't appear. So we'll start with some legal records, and then we'll go into naturalization and military. From there, we're going to just talk about some other records, census and vital, some more familiar record types, but kind of a reminder about what's unique with women in those records. And then we'll end up with a case study and we'll see maybe we can tell a little bit more about the story of Elizabeth, my ancestor. Ready to get started? I sure am. I love this topic. This is a fun topic to discuss. Let's start again with research strategies. Before we go there, though, kind of touching on why it's hard to trace women so we can figure out how to address some of these things. The first thing that makes it very difficult to trace women is the fact that their surnames change. Women change at least in Western European, ancestry, which is what a lot of us are familiar with. A woman's surname changes and can change several times throughout life. So the surname she's born with, what we call her maiden name, is oftentimes not the name she dies under. And for every time that she marries, she may change that surname again. So as we saw, Elizabeth, who was born Crosby, passed away with the surname Taylor. But you might have, an Eleanor who started as a Wood, became a Johnson, then an Anderson. and finally married a Spencer, but then divorced Spencer and went back to Anderson. And soon you're trying to figure out, is Eleanor Wood and Eleanor Anderson the same person? So changing surnames can make it difficult to trace women, and we have to find more clues to try and connect people between records. Another issue for women, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, is the fact that married women specifically are not considered separate legal entities from their husbands. What this means is that they are kind of subsumed or covered. We're going to use the term femme covert. They're kind of covered under their husband's records. So they're kind of hiding in their husband's records because they're not considered those separate, distinct legal entities. Again, that's married women. Sometimes the records that did name women, things like family letters or things that were traded between women in a community, are either less likely to have survived, or if they survived, they don't tend to be those big record sets that we have a lot of accessibility to. And so they do kind of, if they survive, they're going to end up in a special collections at a university or in the personal possession of a family member. So they are become less accessible. It's a little bit harder to connect with those records. It does feel like for a long time, history overlooked women because the stories were told mostly by men. As I oftentimes say, records and history, they're created by men about men for men. So they don't the women and the story of women, that's been more of a recent addition to the stories the historians tell. Back in the last, or starting about in the 1960s and a little bit later, is suddenly when we tried to tell the stories of women and not just the stories of men. So this makes it a little bit harder to trace our female ancestors because sometimes they're not named in the records and their stories were not told and they're not captured. It's so often when working at the Family Search Library, when people come in, the very first thing they always want to research is their patrilineal, their surname line, but that's following men, male to male to male. And it's these stories of the women that we need to capture and make sure are preserved. So let's talk about tracing women in the records. Now, it's easy to kind of conclude or assume or hope that we are going to find records specifically for women, that this is a deed in which a woman sold property. However, when it comes down to it, the basic strategy for tracing women is not to trace women, it's to trace the men in their lives. So as we go through the records that we'll talk about today, consider not just the records that are for women, but what are the records of men or of others that might provide information about the women. And sometimes the records of men or the records of other people aren't going to name your ancestor directly, but they will tell you something about your ancestor. And you have to consider that. You have to really analyze those records. So don't just find the records, but make sure you're really understanding what those records say about the other people in the lives of those people who are named. So keep in mind that we look for records of women, but and we will talk about when those were created and why those were created. But a lot of times we are looking for the records of the men in their lives. And keep in mind that if your ancestor, here's the blue spot, we've got the ancestor. It's easy to just look for her records or to look for her husband's records, but sometimes you are going to need to go a little bit further afield to try and find evidence or references to your ancestor's life. So don't just trace her husband, make sure you're tracing her parents, especially her father, her brothers, which aren't represented here, as well as her children. And you might even need to go further than that. You might need to look at grandparent records, great uncles, uncles and aunts, cousins, siblings, um, in-laws, you know, grandchildren, grandchildren-in-law, even if you're talking about county histories. So make sure that you're really casting a wide net when it comes to finding records of these other people that may have some clues about your ancestors and her life. So again, we can't just focus on records of your ancestor And don't just look at a few people in her life, you really have to look for everybody because you don't know in which situation, maybe there's an uncle or an aunt who didn't have any children and um, died without issue. And so their probate records are going to name your ancestor and provide additional information about her life. So again, cast your net wide, look for lots of people and a lot of records. So that's why it's a little trickier with women because we can't just say, oh yeah, go look for all of John's records. We really need to look for all of Lydia's records, all of John's records, all of their children's records, all of these other people in their lives. Because again, you don't know where she's going to be named. So it's a little bit more like focusing on that fan club or the family, associates, and neighbors. A couple other tips and tricks as you look for women. Um, you can, for example, we'll talk about a little bit naming. Maiden names can be used as a given or a middle name. So you'll want to kind of watch for that for a woman's children. Is there a common a name shows up that you're like, what's going on there? I have an ancestor, or it's a brother or cousin named Sidwell Taylor. Sidwell is not really a given name, but Sidwell is a surname, so Sidwell is probably a maiden name at some point. Remember that women do have all those surnames, so you're going to have to look for her under all those surnames, and always keep in mind there could be more than you're looking for. Also, get to know the common nicknames for women. It's very easy to kind of get confused. I know a lot of people um, are always surprised to find that Polly is a nickname for Mary or Daisy is a nickname for Margaret. So there are really common nicknames for women, and make sure that you know what those are, because you'll see women in the records be Mary in one record and Polly in the next one. Also learn about your ancestors' ethnic group, where they came from, if there's anything unique about women or how they're recorded. It also can tell you a little bit more about the story of their life. And again, locating the records for all the men in a woman's life. And then just make sure you're thinking outside the box because the records you need, I mean, it might be that it ends up being the minutes of a church, and those records for that church are only located at a county historical society. So you do really have to cast a wide net in order to find the records that you're going to need to trace your ancestor. Okay, so let's move on and focus a little bit on some of the records and why women don't appear, when they do appear, and when they start appearing as their own entities. So we're going to start with legal records. And by legal records, I mean, land records, probate records. We won't get into court records, but they kind of apply the same way. And then we'll also touch on divorce. So in the United States, there are kind of two legal systems that we use. Most states use what's called English common law. There are a few states that rely, especially Louisiana, relies on something called civil law. We're not going to touch on civil law today, but if you have ancestors in Louisiana, I would encourage you to go learn about civil law. But under English common law, this English common law kind of came about and then was codified um, by William Blackstone. Um, the Anyway, and in that codification, he wrote that the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Under whole wing protection and cover, she performs everything and is therefore called a femme covert, and her condition during her marriage is called her coverture. What this means is that under English common law, a married woman is a couple is considered one legal entity, but the husband is the public version, the one who does all of the things on behalf of the couple. And therefore, the wife has very little say and doesn't show up as much in the legal records because this limits her ability, a married woman especially, specifically limits her ability to purchase property. When she inherits, the property is either owned or controlled by her husband, and a few other things. So just kind of keep in mind, this is actually one of the big reasons why women are missing from so many of our, maybe not missing, but there aren't records because women were not allowed, or married women were not able to do some of these legal things because as it says, their existence is covered by that of her husband. So again, you'll hear the term femme covert. Now, one thing I do want to note as we talk about women in legal records, there's going to be a big distinction between married women, which is the majority of who we're talking about are married women. These are the women that are not in the records, can't be in the records, as opposed to women who are not covered under the femme covert, who they're called femme sole. That means they're single, divorced, or widowed. They can, for the most part, they can do legal things the same as men do, but you just don't see it happening very often. Um, so kind of keep that in mind. A widowed ancestor is likely to appear in more records. So if your um, ancestor outlived her husband, she may have a few more records as a widow. But if she did not outlive her husband, it's harder to find her in the records. But again, so we'll talk a little bit more here about specifically about married women and some of the issues. And again, some of the times they do appear in the records, but also the times they don't. So married women were able, the few things that they could do, and we'll talk about this individually. They could inherit property, which means that they can be named in probate records and in wills. So that is one place that we will find married women named, and that proves a relationship to a parent. However, that property would be either owned outright by her husband or managed by her husband. They have a right to claim a portion of their husband's property following his decease. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the minutes, called the Dower's right. And again, an opportunity for women to be named in the records. And that's what we're looking for, is why are women named in the records, and when does that happen, so we can look for it. And then they of course can sue for divorce. In addition, there are some other legal and issues where they can be involved, where for example, they might be able to be sued, but if they wanted to bring a lawsuit, they oftentimes had to have a quote male friend, which could be a husband or somebody else, involved in order to sue. So we won't really get into more of the court side of things, but keep in mind that there's a lot of resources if you want to figure that out. If those women again could be involved in court cases. What you're probably noticing again is we come back to this idea that well-behaved women don't make history because legally they are considered um, they're not considered independent from their husbands. So let's talk about a couple of these. We'll start with that they can inherit property. So that does mean that women will be named in probate records. Most men, when they left property to all of their children, including the daughters. So here's an example of a will, and it says, I bequeath and devise to my wife, Anna Liza Worley. So in this case, it's actually to a wife, not to a daughter. I give devise to my wife, Anna Liza Worley, whose maiden name was Nodine, all of the west half of Lot 5 on Block 49 as recorded, and it goes on to more describe what she receives. So we will find women again named in probate records and in wills as that property is passed on from either a parent or from a spouse or from another relative. You might find a second cousin who gives her property. Again, why you want to cast your net wide when looking for records. Another thing, though, that we want to talk about is what's called the dower right. There was a real concern that a man would die and his husband and not leave anything to his wife or his widow, and she would be left destitute and therefore, would have to rely on the state, and the state doesn't want to do that. So this was the dower right was actually from English common law, so it's in most of our colonies and states. The dower right entitles a widow to a third of her husband's property. Usually, it might be a third of his personal property, like outright ownership, and a and a life interest in a third of his real property, or something like that. It does depend on states. When a man dies, then the widow can either, if there's no will, she automatically gets the dowries right, or if there is a will, she has the choice to either accept what she received from the will, or in lieu of her dower, um, or in lieu of what's in the will, she can choose dower instead. So she makes that choice if there is a will. So again, when a man dies, the dower right kicks in. The dower right does vary by time period and state. There are some states that made it dower very small or limited it. And so you don't see as much evidence of this, but it does mean again that a widow is going to be named in her husband's probate records. Now, there are some states, these are mostly in the West and the South, that are based more on civil law, and there is no dower in those. These are called common property states, which are Arizona, California, Idaho, Louisiana, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, and Washington. But these again are later states, and by the time most of these states entered the country, we'll talk a little bit about Married Women's Property Acts would have eliminated some of these requirements. One of the big benefits, however, because of the dower right, is that when a man sold property, his wife essentially had a claim on that property. And so even though when he bought it, he would buy it under his name, when he sells, his wife has to consent to the sale of that land. If for some reason he does not get the wife's, consent, and then he passes away, legally, his widow then has the right to go back to the current owner and sue for her dower or her 1/3 interest in that property. What this means is because women have to consent to the sale, that both the husband and the wife are going to be listed on land records when the land is sold. They're listed as grantors. So they're both going to sign the document, acknowledge that they agree to the sale, and there's oftentimes a little note that says that the wife was examined separate and apart, meaning separate from her husband, so no peer pressure, to determine whether she approved of the sale of land. Again, due to this dower release. This is usually called the dower release. Again, dower rights vary by time period and location, but they are very important. This is an example. So this is a land record in which Ezekiel Cleaver is selling property in Frederick County, Virginia. After the sale, there is a note written that the clerk actually felt it was so important to get this dower release that he sent a note to the sheriff of Warren County, Ohio, and had the sheriff of Warren County, Ohio, because the Cleavers had moved from Virginia to Ohio. And I should tell you, this is 1805. So he sends a note to Ohio and has the sheriff of Warren County, Ohio, go out to find Abigail Cleaver, Ezekiel's wife, to get the dower release. So it was so important to this clerk in Virginia that he actually, again, contacted a different state in 1805 to get the dower release. So we see here, we, the underwritten, did personally go to Abigail Cleaver, the wife of Ezekiel Cleaver, and examine her privily and apart from her said husband, whether she executed the therein mentioned indenture of her own free and voluntary consent without the persuasions or threats or other undue influence of her said husband. So it goes on to explain that, yes, Abigail gave her approval and the sale did go forward. But again, they're actually writing to a whole different state to get this dower release. They felt it was that important. So again, this is really beneficial that land records will name women and will have this quote signature of a woman. Okay, so under English common law, again, married women didn't have a lot of rights. However, starting in the mid-19th century, the individual states started passing a series of acts or laws that pretty much made women legal entities. And so these are known as Married Women's Property Acts. So these are, again, state statutes, and they gave women the control of their own property and the ability to buy and sell property. The first state that really passed a kind of a version of this was in 1839. Mississippi passed an act that just protected the dower against her husband's creditors. And then a few other states gave a few more rights to married women in the following years. However, in 1848, New York passed what's kind of the precedent for the Married Women's Property Acts, and this became a template for most other states. So in the following years, every other state would pass one of these acts, and states entering the union would not have, would not have those same limitations following at this point. So at this point, those property acts just gave a woman control over her own property. Her property was no longer subject to her husband's debts. It allowed her to sign contracts, sue and be sued. She can write a will, devise property. And this is when we're going to start to see women actually named in the deeds on their own account. So they're the ones who are going to buy and sell property, and they're the ones who we're going to see a lot more wills written, and that's going to be for both now married women as much as those single, widowed, and divorced women. So kind of 1848 is the kind of big year, but again, you have to figure out what year your state passed a Married Women's Property Act, allowing, again, women to be kind of separate legal entities. So here kind of is an example of this. This is kind of a little complicated as we look at this, but we'll see what's going on. So this is a series of deeds in which Peter Flint and Sally, his wife, they live in Montgomery County, New York. They first in 11th of December, you notice the date, they gave 3 acres of land to their daughter named Sarah Jane Wendell, who's the wife of Oscar. So at this point, giving the land to Sarah meant that Sarah it was going to be under her control. She no longer had to have her husband involved. It was now going to be her property. And it appears they're passing on almost an inheritance because they give it to her for natural love and affection and the sum of $1. On that same day, they give some property to a William H. Flint. He was probably another child of theirs at the same time. Now, at this point, Peter, because he bought all of the property prior to 1848, it was all kind of in his possession. But he wants to make sure that, that his wife Sally has some ownership and right, and therefore kind of her own inheritance. So about the same time period, just 4 days later, in a series of 2 deeds, and sometimes they weren't always sure how to transfer from like a husband to a wife, how to transfer property because of all of the legal entanglements. So what he actually did was he and Sally sold 2 pieces of property to Sarah Jane Wendell and Oliver, her husband, for $1,000. And on the same day, then Oliver and Sarah Jane sold it to Sally for $1,000, meaning Peter's no longer on the deed. So effectively, the $1,000 probably never changed hands. But we can see this now that Sally and the daughter, Sarah Jane Wendell, can both own property for themselves. So again, we're seeing the impact of the Married Women's Property Act, that these 2 married women are allowed to hold this property independent and separate from their husband's ownership, which is, again, a benefit for them. So they now control their own property. A few years later, same kind of a thing, we now see that Sally Flint, because she now owns those 2 pieces of property, actually left a will, in which she gives property to her daughter, Sarah Jane Wendell, as well as to a couple of sons. So again, this is kind of the fallout of those Married Women Property Acts. This is when you're going to start seeing your female ancestors, if they're so inclined, can buy and sell property, leave wills, and again are now legal entities as married women as opposed to being covered by their husbands. So next, I just want to touch a little bit on divorce records, because this is, again, an opportunity for women to appear in the records. Legally, husbands were required to support their wives, and when that didn't happen, then the wife could sue for divorce. Modernly, we do have what are called no-fault divorces, but historically, you did have to have a cause. And there are 2 kinds of divorces that may be granted. One is called an absolute divorce, or vinculo matrimony. This is what we modernly call a divorce. Everyone's allowed to remarry. The couple are completely separated. But there was another type of divorce that's almost more like a legal separation today. It's called a divorce from bed and board, or a menso et thoro, where the husband is still required to pay maintenance, and neither part of the couple can remarry. There are a lot of causes for divorce. The big 3 are usually adultery, abandonment, or cruelty. Those are the reasons that a couple may be granted a divorce. And keep in mind that a judge was not required to grant the divorce. So there are cases in which a judge might say, I don't see any evidence that this is going on. So again, I'm not going to grant the divorce. You guys are still married. But again, here, this is a fun list just pulled from a great resource called The Hidden Half of the Family, which is a source book for women's genealogy. And this is a list of possible causes of divorce in 1895. You do get a lot of things like drunkenness, for example, but an abandonment. You usually had to be abandoned for a certain number of years before you could um, sue for divorce. Again, an opportunity for a woman who's usually kind of disappears into from the records to actually create records and go into court. So this is an example of a divorce. We won't read the entire thing, but this is a Tennessee Boaz against Samuel Boaz in Madison County, Mississippi. Um, and she goes out, she explains why she's suing for divorce. So it it says that they lived together as his wife, except when forced by his drunkenness and an inhuman and cruel treatment to go to her father's house for protection. She goes on, and it sounds like he had been a bit of a drunkard, and he continued drinking, and the more he drank, the worse off it got. But she also does acknowledge that they do have one daughter who's 12 years of age and the only living issue of their marriage. So, opportunity to see relationships and to prove generational connections. But yeah, so divorces, if your ancestor did file for divorce, and even if they weren't granted one, there should be some records of that. And again, an opportunity for women to be named in the records. Next, let's talk a little bit about naturalization and military, another opportunity, another times women appear in the records. I'm going to start just with specifically kind of especially because we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of this a few years ago, is suffrage, when women were given the right to vote. A reminder that the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, though a lot of states had prior to that had given women the right to vote. And the reason this is important is it's actually going to impact naturalization and when women are going to naturalize on their own. So, speaking of naturalization, and historically, there's not really anything in the laws that indicate that an immigrant woman cannot naturalize. However, there's not really any benefit for her to naturalize because the traditional benefits, especially the right to vote, are she can't vote, so why would she naturalize on her own? There are kind of some different time periods. If an alien, if a man had filed his first papers and then passed away, his widow could then obtain citizenship just with an oath of allegiance from 1804 to 1934. But for the most part, women were granted what's called derivative citizenship. That means if they married a citizen or if their husband, an alien husband, naturalized, by default, they became a naturalized citizen. So there was not a separate process. They could just obtain that citizenship through their husband. There wasn't really a need for a woman to naturalize separately. However, starting in 1907, we start to see the laws get a little bit more stringent about women and her citizenship status. So, starting from 1907 to 1922, a woman's citizenship was completely tied to her husband's. What this means is that if a woman who was naturalized or was natural born married an alien, she actually lost her citizenship, which is a kind of frustrating thing in retrospect. But if the husband then, of course, naturalized, then she would be renaturalized. But if that husband couldn't naturalize for some reason, there were certain, classes and things that couldn't naturalize, or he chose not to naturalize, she pretty much lost her citizenship and she was no longer a citizen of the United States. And that woman could not naturalize without her husband and her husband's involvement. So at this point in time, so if you're looking for a quote naturalization record for somebody who's when their naturalization is tied completely to their husband's, it's really the marriage record plus the husband's naturalization that's going to provide evidence of her naturalization, if a naturalization happened, of course. Starting in 1922, and this is again why I mentioned suffrage, is because when women had the right to vote, suddenly they were all like, oh, maybe women should naturalize separately from their husbands. So that's what happened 3 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. So starting in 1922, women are going to have to naturalize on their own. So they are not, I mean, they still might be named in their husband's naturalization papers, but you should find their naturalization papers for them as well. If they married a citizen, they still had to file a petition. They didn't have to go through the whole naturalization process, but no longer did they receive that derivative citizenship. And of course, they no longer lost their citizenship by marrying an alien. So if your female ancestor was living in the United States post 1922 and her husband had not yet naturalized, look for her naturalization records as well. Now, there are a really fascinating group of records called repatriation files, because starting in 1936, all of these women who had lost their citizenship from 1907 to 1922, they didn't have to naturalize anymore. They could just take an oath of allegiance to get their citizenship back. And because all of these women were saying this isn't fair, that me marrying an alien made me naturalize again. And so these repatriation files are a great source of records, again, about women, and sometimes it gives information about where they were born, even here in the United States. So this is an example. This is a declaration of intention and a petition for naturalization for Martha Margaret Carimo. It indicates that she was born in Liverpool, England, and these are her. Um, no, that she immigrated from Liverpool. I apologize, and she was born in Finland, which was formerly Russia. So gives some information about herself. And then here's an example of one of those petitions for a woman who lost her citizenship. This Ella Iglesias. It says she's born on the 13th day of June at Baltimore, Maryland. She's always resided in the US. But it's because she had married her husband. Down, you can see her husband was named Enrique, and he was born in Mexico. Okay, so naturalization, that's where women start to appear more in the records. Military records, we're going to talk about first about pensions specifically, or bounty land that women or widows were qualified for, and then we'll talk a little bit about women in the military itself. So keep in mind that widows oftentimes or almost always qualified to receive money or something from the government based on their husband's military service. So Revolutionary War, War of 1812 veterans, Mexican War veterans, all qualified for pensions at some point, as well as widows of Civil War soldiers. They also allowed what are called dependent mothers of Civil War soldiers to qualify for pensions as well. So just kind of a history of some dates that should be in your handout as well. Note that Confederate states, or formerly Confederate states, also provided widows' pension. Now, in order to qualify for a widow's pension, they have to prove a few things. This is why widows' pensions can be so informative. Of course, they have to prove the death of the veteran, that he's passed away. They have to prove that they were married to the veteran, and that they were the current wife of the veteran at the time of his death. So if there were other wives, you might get evidence of that. Sometimes they have to prove they're indigent, they need the money. And of course, they have to prove that they haven't remarried since the veteran died. So these pension files can be very fascinating. So a couple examples from pension files. This is a certificate of record of marriage for John Knoblaw and Lyda Klaus. And we get the day they're married, who married them, and everything. And this is included in that widow's pension. Or this is a fun note in that same widow's pension that says, this is to certify that I've known Mr. John Knoblaw for 48 years and know from my own personal knowledge that Mr. John Knoblaw was never married prior to his marriage to Eliza. I also have known Mrs. Eliza Knoblaw ever since she was a schoolgirl, which I think is helpful if I'm trying to figure out who Eliza's parents are, because this particular, the person who signed this note, Aaron Dunbar, I can find him when he was young and see if I can find Eliza nearby. And then it says, from my own personal knowledge, she was never married, as I've known them both ever since they became of marriageable age. Says, I was a neighbor of Mrs. Knoblaugh's father and served almost 3 years in the same company with Mr. John Knoblaugh in the War of the Rebellion. So again, these affidavits can give some other clues and information that's going to help us trace these women. This is a situation, a different pension, in which a widow is actually trying to demonstrate that though her husband, her deceased husband, had been married prior to her, that prior wife was deceased. And so we get a couple of affidavits. I was intimately acquainted with the soldier above named and his first wife, as well as widow his second wife. I attended the funeral of both the soldier and his first wife, whose maiden name was Ruth Mullen. Or here is actually an affidavit from the soldier's or the veteran's first wife's brother, indicating that he had married his sister, but she had died in 1865 prior to the marriage to the current widow. So you're going to get a lot of detail about these families. So even if you're researching somebody who married a veteran but didn't get a widow's pension, but the veteran's second wife did, you still want that pension file. Another way that women could get show up with military records is through bounty land. There are three bounty land acts, the Act of 1850, 52, and 55, all allowed, these three bounty land acts gave bounty land to men who had served in Revolutionary War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and the Indian Wars. And it also allowed for widows to apply for that bounty land if the veteran was deceased. So kind of note that if your ancestor served in the War of 1812 but died before these bounty land acts, his widow might have applied for bounty land. And that widow, in order again to prove that she has the right, has to prove that the soldier or the veteran is deceased, indicate when and where they married, and provide that evidence in order to qualify. So here's an example in which Divine Embry, 64 years of age, a resident of Campbell County, Georgia, appeared in court. She says she's the widow of Merrill Embry, who's deceased. She indicates when and Merrill served in the War of 1812. And then she indicates she was married to the said Merrill Embry in Oglethorpe County on 6th of December, 1804, and goes on to give information about her maiden name and his death. Okay, so in addition, though, to widows qualifying for property from husband's military service, keep in mind women also did serve in the military in some capacity, and therefore oftentimes qualified for pensions and for other benefits on their own. So in the 18th and 19th century, they're more camp followers. They might be carrying messages, move contraband, track troop movement. However, a lot of this never would qualify. It did not qualify for them for pensions. But the big area in which women started to qualify for pensions and again getting benefits and producing records is by serving as nurses. So during the Civil War, there were 3,000 nurses in the Union Army, and they also qualified for pensions starting in 1892. And they were allowed to be buried, so, for example, at Arlington. The Spanish-American War, there were 1,500 nurses, again, qualifying for pensions and, again, having military records, essentially. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps was established in 1901, the Navy in 1908, leading to about 20,000 nurses serving in World War I and 60,000 in World War II. And again, all of these women would qualify for pensions. In addition to nurses, starting with World War I, women actually did participate in non-combat roles in the military. There's something called this National Service School, which trained women and allowed women to serve in the military in support roles. So about 25,000 women served in World War I, both in the Navy as yeomen or yeomanettes and in the Army Signal Corps. But again, they held mostly non-combat roles. During World War II, about 140,000 women served in a variety of different capacities, from the Waves, the WAC, the WASP, and you can see that those are abbreviations for longer things. In total, women filled about 200 different non-combat roles. Again, this service is going to qualify them for, you're going to see military files on these women as well. So here's an example of a pension payment card for a woman who worked as a nurse, Sister Mary Celestine Doyle, and she had served in the medical department of the U.S. Army. Okay, a couple other record types. Reminder, census records do name women starting in 1850, but if a woman was the head of household, she will be named on the censuses from 1790 to 1840. 1840 census actually asked for the names of the widows of Revolutionary War veterans. Of course, by 1850, they ain't going to name all the censuses. 1850 to 1880 census, we do have the mortality schedules. Of course, we get 1880 to 1930 censuses will ask birthplace of the mother. Again, when we're casting our net wide and looking for the other family members, that can be helpful as well. We get marital status through some of these. Don't forget the defective, dependent, and delinquent schedules from 1880. This is an opportunity to see women as well and sometimes better understand what's going on in her life. Here's an example from Sussex County, Delaware, of women living in a county almshouse. And you can see kind of why they're living there. Old age, poverty, epilepsy, cripple. Not, of course, the politically correct term, but that's what it's recorded. Starting in 1880, women could be hired as enumerators, and so we'll see those appear more often. The 1900 to 1910 census asks for the number of years married, number of children born and living. 1930 asks the age at first marriage. 1940 asked who the informant was. We find that's often the housewife or the woman living at home. So we know the information about her is accurate. And that 1940 census has some supplementary questions that actually asked if they were married more than once, their age at first marriage, and the number of children ever born to them. So if your ancestor's on one of those lines, you want to make sure that you look down for her line down below in the supplementary questions. Unfortunately, the 1950 census doesn't appear to have specific questions for women. So going to the 1940 census, this is down at the bottom for all women who have or have been married. Again, those three questions. And so we have this Edith May Peak, and it says this woman has not been married before. She was 17 at her first marriage, and she's had 9 children. So good information, just sometimes buried. So make sure that you're looking at this. Okay, keep in mind vital records. We're pretty familiar with looking for vital records, so I won't spend too much time on them. Marriage records can list a maiden name. Keep in mind that there are age requirements usually to get married. That's going to vary by state. For brides, that's usually 18. So if she married under the legal age of 18, make sure you're looking for a consent affidavit or some other evidence that she got consent from her guardian or parent. And they traditionally marry at the place of the bride's residence, which is a good thing because wherever they got married, that's where you're going to start looking for her parents. Birth and death records, keep in mind there's not a limitation that says we don't keep records for women. So again, once birth and death become more common, there are records for women. But also, again, as you're casting your net wider, that you look for the birth records of their children. It might list, of course, her maiden name. And some of those birth records will list the number of children born to a mother, the total number, as well as those currently living. And again, death records is another great place to try and find a woman's maiden name. Her children's death record may list her maiden name. So a good place to start. So here's an example of a death record in which the maiden name of the mother is listed. Look for women do have headstones, just like everyone else. Headstones can list maiden names, may include, relationships on those, such as daughter of or wife of. But when you're looking in a cemetery, make sure you're not just looking for your ancestor. Look for everyone buried around her in the same plot and even in the nearby plots, because sometimes, a couple is actually buried with her family, not his family. Keep in mind there are a couple of unique terms on headstones. These also show up sometimes in obituaries, and these should be in your handout. A consort just simply means their husband is still living, and relict means they're predeceased by their husband. So here's some examples. Here's a headstone for Sarah Byers Klaus. So we see her maiden name is on the record. And then here's Nancy, wife of William Hamilton, and we get her death date. So not her maiden name, but we do get a relationship on her headstone. Another place that we see women is newspapers, especially those, as the newspapers have more and more information in them. You'll get things like obituaries, maybe marriage announcements. There could be evidence of marital issues, especially when they get dramatic, like the woman I read about who tracked her husband down to a bar and shot him. There's a lot of evidence in newspapers of societies and organizations, and women are very involved in these kinds of societies. Kind of also consider who are the local correspondents that are women who are providing a lot of the information from the small towns to the newspaper offices. So a couple of examples. This is my great grandmother, Mrs. Ben Taylor, laid to rest. We get a lot of information about her ancestors. She was born in Reed City, Michigan in 1880 as Miss Fanny Souls, and she came to California and attended the Los Angeles Normal School and then married a Ben F. Taylor. Here's the marriage record for Fanny and Ben. I know it's a little difficult to read, but what's fun is that the local correspondent actually wrote out a poem to go with their marriage, which is a kind of um, a fun thing to find. And then you get other kinds of society news. We had seen earlier that Fanny had come to Los Angeles or to the California areas to teach. So it says, school is expected to commence next week at Wildemar. Miss Souls of Los Angeles will be our teacher for the coming term. Or here she expects to spend her 2 weeks vacation from teaching with relatives in Los Angeles. That's a good clue that she has relatives in Los Angeles. And then here are three, all of these are about the same family, but the middle one specifically says Mrs. J.B. Souls and two sons, Neil and Roy, arrived at Wildemar last week from Reed City, Michigan. They are mother and brothers of Mrs. B.F. Taylor and expect to make their home in California. So again, lots of good information about women can be found in newspapers. And then don't forget county histories as well. And if you look in your handout, I listed a bunch of other records that you don't want to forget as you're researching your ancestors. So county histories oftentimes will, tell a little bit about the genealogy of the person. These county histories, these bios and these county histories are almost always for men, but you'll get these kind of histories of their female ancestors as well. So it says here that the son Andrew, the father of David Ambler, was married to Mary Johnson, who's the daughter of Benjamin and Abigail Johnson of Richland, Bucks County. So kind of keep in mind again that this is a situation in which the record is not for your female ancestor, but they can be named. Okay, so I hope you kind of thought the various record types, when women appear, when women don't appear, why they don't appear, but also what records to look for. And especially this idea that to really understand and research your female ancestors, you have to research everybody else in her life. So let's kind of take a look at how that works together with a case study. So we mentioned earlier, this is one of my ancestors, Elizabeth Crosby Taylor. She'd married a Benjamin Taylor. She has one son who's born in 1836 in Warren County, Ohio, and she died in childbirth. So not a lot of information known. Does that mean we're completely limited? We're not going to find anything else? Well, let's take a look at what we can find. And again, that idea that she has no photo available, she's kind of anonymous. But maybe there's something more that we can learn about her if we cast our net a little wider. And I won't go through everything I found, but just a couple of things. So of course, I started with her marriage record. This is an opportunity for her to be actually named in the records. This is an 1835 marriage. Says this is to certify that on the 5th day of November 1835, Benjamin Taylor and Elizabeth Crosby were joined in marriage by the undersigned, a justice of the peace in and for Warren Court. So we've got her marriage record. She's named there. She also does have a headstone in the local cemetery in Springboro. The headstone's a little bit difficult to read, but I went through and transcribed it. Just says in memory of Elizabeth. wife of Benjamin Taylor, departed this life the 20th of ninth month, 1836, age 25 years, 6 months, and 13 days. So these are the only two records, that I can find out there that are actually for Elizabeth herself. But that doesn't mean that's what I'm limited to. So we do find when she died, how old she was, when she married, and we do know she had a son. But if we start casting our net a little bit wider and looking a little bit broader, we're going to start looking for mostly the men in her life. So I'm not going to go again through all the records and how I got there, but kind of keep in mind. So one thing I noticed on her headstone is it uses the term she departed this life 20th of ninth month, which is a clue to me that she is Quaker, or that there's a connection to the Quakers. We'll clarify this. So I went and through the Quaker meeting minutes. Now she's never named in the meeting minutes. However, Benjamin, her husband is. So on the 26th of the 5th month of 1836, remember she married in November of 1835, says the preparative meeting informs that Benjamin Taylor has accomplished his marriage contrary to discipline. What this means is that Benjamin was a Quaker, but Elizabeth was not. And that actually gets him in trouble with the meeting. So the 23rd of the 6th month, the friends appointed to visit Benjamin Taylor reported that they had an opportunity with him and that he did not desire to retain his right of membership. So Benjamin chose not to continue as a Quaker after his marriage to Elizabeth. So again, Elizabeth's not named, but it tells me a little bit about what's going on with this couple. Now, there are a few years later, there's a few other interesting notes in the meeting minutes. So this is October of 1838, or the 10th month in 1838. It says the monthly meeting was informed that carved and lettered stones have been placed at several graves in our burying ground in violation of the established usage. The men appointed to ascertain who placed, so it appointed men to ascertain who placed them and to request them forthwith to remove them. The Quakers were very strict. They did not like, a lot of them did not put headstones or grave markers in their burying grounds. They felt that was kind of too fancy for them. And they reported the next month that the friends who had been appointed to figure out who placed these headstones reported that it was Benjamin Taylor and Mordecai Taylor Jr. have placed them, but declined moving them. So pretty much Benjamin and his brother Mordecai had buried, and we'll talk a little bit about Mordecai in a minute, but they had it seems like is that Benjamin actually buried his wife, who died in childbirth, in the Quaker burying ground, even though he had declined his membership, and then he had placed a carved and lettered headstone, and that got him in trouble. And the in the end, the meeting said we're going to do what we want, even though these two Taylor brothers won't move the grave markers. They moved them for him. The headstone that I showed you just a minute ago is actually in a different cemetery, the Springboro City Cemetery. That was laid out in 1867, actually by Benjamin's son Ambrose. And at that point, it appears that they moved several family members from the Quaker burying ground. And I kind of wonder if that headstone that we just looked at is the headstone that got Benjamin Taylor in trouble in 1838. But it kind of tells us a little bit more about Elizabeth and where she's buried and what was going on in that time period. So again, we get more of her story by looking for the records for her husband. We also want to look for records of parents. Now, I won't go through the whole process how I figured out who her parents are, but there is another Crosby family in the area, and that Crosby family I followed forward, and I found a will for a Robert Crosby. Now, this will was written in 1850, approved in 1854, so way after Elizabeth was buried or passed away. However, it does identify Elizabeth's father. So this will, I, Robert Crosby, of the County of Warren and State of Ohio, will in a sound state of mind and memory make and ordain my last will and testament. And Robert Crosby's will divides his estate into 5 equal parts. It leaves property to a son, James, a daughter Hannah Surface, a daughter Mary Kelsey, and a daughter Martha Crosby. And then the fifth part was left to his grandson Ambrose Taylor and son of my daughter Elizabeth, who intermarried with Benjamin Taylor. So this will, from years after Elizabeth's death, is actually proving her father. And the entire probate provides a little bit more detail as well. So again, not a record for Elizabeth, but a record of her father provides additional information about Elizabeth. And then using that, I can go back and find Robert Crosby in the 1830 census, there where he's actually living in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And in his household, there are two females aged 15 to 20, one of whom would be Elizabeth based on her birth year. So again, she's not named in this record, but we can conclude that she's there, again, telling her story, that at one point in time she lived in Pennsylvania. I also cast my net a little further afield and I found um, a, bio, um, a county history with biographies for the nearby Montgomery County, Ohio, that's near to Warren County. And instead of looking for Robert, I found a William A. Crosby. You're thinking, okay, who's William and how is he related? Well, it turns out that William is the son of James. So, William, a successful farmer of Mad River Township, Montgomery County, was born near Springboro, which we've seen already. He is the son of James and Lydia. Now, James was the son of Robert, and I didn't include everything this county history had, and was a son of Robert. So, William A. Crosby is Elizabeth's nephew. So we're casting our net a little further afield, and this tells us that Robert Crosby, father of James Crosby, was a native of County Down, the most easterly county in Ireland, and was of Scotch-Irish descent. When a young man, he came to the United States and settled in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, being accompanied by two of his brothers. And in 1830, he came to Ohio, dying on the farm where he settled in Warren County. He was of a quiet and amiable disposition, reared a family of one son and five daughters, and at his death was 75 years of age. Now, is Elizabeth named in this record? She's not. However, we've established that Robert's her father, that James is her brother, and we find that he had raised his family, that her father raised his family in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. So we know that's where she was raised. And we know that in 1830 he came to Ohio. So now we know what year Elizabeth came to Ohio. And it does say that he had that one son and five daughters, she's being one of those five daughters. And we've already seen that with his will. We saw four daughters and one son. Now, I do have a little more benefit for Elizabeth in that we do have some private family records. And you want to make sure that you're pursuing things like private family records or records in county court, county historical societies and things to try and learn a little bit more about the women in your ancestors. So I do have in that I've got a family Bible. The family Bible says Benjamin Taylor's second wife. Yes, Benjamin was married three times. Was Elizabeth Crosby, born March 7th, 1811, married November 5th, 1835, and died September 20th, 1836. And it also tells me that Mordecai Taylor, remember Benjamin and Mordecai placing the gravestones, married and married Anne Crosby, who was the sister to Elizabeth, wife of Benjamin. She was born, and it gives her birth date, and she married in 1837 and also died in childbirth in 1838. So I've kind of concluded that the two brothers buried their wives, who had both died in childbirth, in the Quaker burying ground and put carved and lettered headstones, which got them in trouble with the meeting. In addition, my family has inherited a number of letters that were written to Elizabeth once she moved to Ohio from a number of cousins she had back in Delaware. And I thought this one was fun. This is a couple weeks after her marriage. I take up my pen this afternoon for the purpose of sending you a little news in return for some Ohio news you gave me on the stay 2 weeks. And he goes on and he says, I congratulate you on the change you have been making very much. And I do wish Mr. Taylor and yourself all the happiness this world is capable of bestowing. And I would be much pleased to see you both in particular. So this again is this cousin who is reaching out, and these family letters are still have been inherited by some of my cousins. So we get a little bit more of the story by looking beyond just the records that are easily accessible, and by looking for people beyond just my female ancestor. I have to look for the other people. I have to cast my net wide. So whereas I started with not a lot of information about Elizabeth, I do have a little bit more, and I know a little bit more about her story. I do know what she was 24 when she married and died at the age of 25. Okay, so our objectives today were to talk about some research strategies. I've already gone over time, so we're going to just speed through this. We went through some legal records and why women appear in the records, touched a little bit on naturalization and military, some other records, and then ended with a case study. So I don't think we have a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to help with to answer one or two if there's time.
All right, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, Beth. We invite all of you in our audience today to take a survey and provide feedback for this class. The link will be posted in the comments section. If you have a question about tracing women, please type it into the comments. And remember, we only have a couple of minutes, so we might not be able to get to everything. Right, I do have a question from Caitlin. I know you covered this in the presentation, but she asks, what records might show the mother in the mid-1800s?
So I think we have to keep in mind that we trace women a little bit more indirectly. So, you know, birth records, that's great. But what you're really trying to do is if you can prove the father and then prove the father's wife and then prove that the father married the wife before the child was born. So it's harder to find a record that's specifically going to identify a mother in that time period in those records. But don't forget to come forward in time and see if there are records when somebody dies, it can name their mother, an obituary could name a mother, a county history could name a mother. So again, tracing those descendants is going to be just as important.
Thank you. What a great answer. Ashley from StreamYard asks, are there any great websites for finding death certificates?
So death certificates are, I would definitely start with the Family Search Research Wiki. Death certificates are awesome when they exist, but it really is a state by state situation. So you need to understand the state you're in. What year did they start keeping death certificates? When does the state hold them? So there's not just one. I would look, Ancestry's got some, Family Search has some, MyHeritage has some, the states have some. You're kind of going to want to look in a lot of places. So again, start with the state, look at the research wiki and see what it suggests.
The research wiki is definitely a great place to start. So Susan from StreamYard has a question about finding obituaries for women.
Just how to find them?
Yeah. How do you do it?
So if you're, what I would do is start identify where a woman died and and when she died, of course, and then also consider if that's the place she's been living for most of her life. Because if she, for example, moved to live with a child, then you might go back and look for an obituary in the town where she raised her children because they might have actually published it somewhere else or where she's buried. But from there, you just need to figure out what newspapers were published. It's the Library of Congress, right, Julia, that has that great unified directory. Take a look and see what newspapers were published in the time period. And, there's all these great newspaper websites, newspapers.com, Newspaper Archive, Genealogy Bank. But the problem is they're not comprehensive. They don't have every newspaper. So if you know what newspapers are published at the time, see if those newspaper sites have that newspaper for that time period first. And then you can search, but you can also browse page by page. And when you search, make sure that you're looking sometimes for her husband's name, because a lot of those, I don't know if you saw that the obituary I did show was for a Mrs. B.F. Taylor. Women oftentimes are named under their husband. But if you're kind of at a loss and you can't find that newspaper, contact the local public library and see if they have copies and they'd be willing to do, a page by page search for 2 or 3 days after that woman died. So again, target the newspaper. It might not be online yet.
Thank you. What great answers. What a fantastic presentation. That is all the time that we have for questions today. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar.